This is the second part of, inshallah, what I plan to be a 5-part series on the mysterious journey of Hazrat Musa alayhi salam, Khidr alayhi salam, wa Yusha alayhi salam. Peace be upon all of them. So let me begin with a recap of what we did last week. Last week was the introduction and setting the stage. So we began with reading the Quranic account in full, and we even repeated it. Then we read a really essential complement to the Quranic account, which is authentic narration, which is included in most authentic collections. And we read a well-known, a famous version from Al-Bukhari, which sheds a lot of light, but then we also pointed out that it seemingly also raises more questions. We'll get back to that, inshallah, later. Then we talked about the traditional interpretations, and a lot of those really stick close to the Quranic interpretation, integrated with the prophetic commentary, because it seems like that already gives a coherent explanation. I emphasize it seems, because today we are going to actually start asking questions and see if the traditional interpretation really answers them. So at the end of the lecture last week, we had started talking about some tafsir, some interpretation methods that we will be using. And that is where, inshallah, we are going to continue today. So the plan for today, I'm going to complete the presentation of the tafsir methodology. After doing that, we will start talking about the story in some depth. And in particular, we are going to go over some questions that suggest there are some critical gaps in our understanding of the story according to the traditional interpretation. In particular, there are some questions that I hope you will agree once you see them. They are crucial. They are obvious once you hear them, but they have never been asked to my knowledge. And I will also point out some tensions with Quranic principles that is really lurking there in the traditional interpretation. Then we are going to turn, inshallah, to a systematic analysis of the Quranic account. Before we move further, we are going to apply some of the methods that we discussed, and we are going to learn some, I think, interesting angles, a new perspective, so to speak, to look at the story. For example, the story has an unusual degree of structure built into it. Very systematic. And as far as I know, there is no explanation for, why these repeating patterns exactly in this way. And there are some really key words that are rare. They don't occur in other places. Usually when that happens, you can suspect a little bit that the Quran maybe is trying to hide some things, just makes it, demands a bit more effort from us, basically, to really get to the meaning. But there's something behind it usually when there are some rare words in a passage, and this passage is full of them, as I'm going to talk about. And there's also parallel structures that we'll identify. In particular, the three scenes, the way they are told, really kind of follows the exact same formula over and over. What I will not talk about is that there is a parallel between these three scenes in this story and the three journeys that the King Zulkarnain takes in the story that immediately follows the Musa and Khidr story. I will not really get into it, because if we get into it, we cannot get out of it. But just to give you like a quick idea, each one of these scenes start with the same key word, almost like an incantation. It says fantalaqa. That's the beginning of basically that journey, that scene. And in the story of Zulkarnain, he also happens to take three journeys, and each one begins with فَأَتْبَعَ سَبَبًا. And there are similarities between these stories and those journeys, but inshallah that's for another time. I am not sure if I will get to the fourth question today, but I want to talk about the question of Majma al-Bahrain. Not so much because its physical location is crucial, but there is some remarkable symbolism that is built into the Quran. And this is something that I have recently noticed myself a few months ago, and since then it has kind of blown my mind. Yes, but maybe today, inshallah, or otherwise next week. And the conclusion, or if you will, tentative conclusion will be that, the traditional interpretation, it's not being wrong, okay? Like there's nothing wrong with it, but it does not explain everything. If you want to think of like an analog, especially those who are interested or work in scientific fields, there was nothing wrong with Newton's theory of Newton's mechanic, but it was incomplete. In some very important cases, it failed. Nowhere else it failed actually, and they never noticed that it failed because those edge cases never really arose in the world until the 20th century. So, and then they realized there's a more general theory that actually also is consistent with the other one. So that's kind of how I think about, it's a natural process of growth and progress in tafsirs. So the core reading principles, as you will remember, we had started, so I will go over the first two pretty quickly. I will just remind you and then move on to the third one, which we haven't seen. The first principle was that bayan is divine. And I mean human bayan. Its origin is divine. And we look at Surah Ar-Rahman, which begins, this is the very beginning of the surah. It says, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Ar-Rahman, Allama al-Quran, Khalaqa al-Insan, Allamahu al-Bayan. The most gracious, the Rahman, taught the Quran, created humans and taught them articulate speech or eloquent speech. So what this means is any kind of beautiful speech, flowing speech, but also speech that has wisdom in it, speech that really clearly distinguishes between very complex concepts, clarifies them, and does so with elegance, with eloquence. That comes from him. Okay, human bayan and eloquence comes from the same divine source as the one who wrote the Quran. So the first principle that we talked about, we said, and I cannot tell for sure how clear this idea is, but the idea is that every time, for example, when I read the Quran, at the back of my mind is all the masterful writings I have read in my life, all the ingenious storytellings I have heard in my life. And I realize all of them come from Allah. if we notice something in conversation, if like a subtly different way of saying something actually indicates a big difference, right? We read between the lines, we can tell the tone. We learned all of it from him. So why do we think that there, when Allah Jalla Jalaluhu, in his divine speech, that will not be there? If you think about this, the name, Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahim, I think these names, you could argue, almost demand that they are there. Because Arhamur Rahimin wants to make it easy for us to understand his Quran. Like he wants to make everything easy for his beloved creation. So there, he already trains us with human speech. And then when we turn to Quran, it's just like the verse in the Quran that says, in the Jannah, in the heaven, inshallah, when, inshallah, all of us, when they eat the fruits, they will say, we somehow recognize this from somewhere. So it is the same feeling. Of course, the fruit in the world is a much lower version of that, but it will carry some signs of it. And I would say the same is true for human masterpieces in literature, in poetry, in storytelling. Very often, for example, in poetry especially, there will be double meanings or, triple meanings. And the Quran is truly a master of that. Sometimes all those, meanings, they will reinforce each other and you will say, wow, it just said this in 3 different ways in one word. So that is something that I think is a principle that I hold very dear, and I find it to be extremely fruitful. The second one is that the Quran itself declares that it tells the most beautiful stories. Again, notice these are all at the very beginning of the surahs. One of the truly most beautiful stories in the Quran, Surah Yusuf, begins with this assertion. It says, نَحْنُ نَقُصُّ عَلَيْكَ أَحْسَنَ الْقَصَصِ. We do relate to you the most beautiful of stories. And so the second principle is, remember last week we said, piety, really truly following, I think, the command of Allah regarding the Quran is to take it very seriously, is never to underestimate it. If it says that it tells the most beautiful stories, there is no equivocating about that. There is no saying that, oh no, it actually means. So one very curious thing that you see when you read the classical tradition of tafsir is that there is a bigger gap between the Salafi Salihin, these are the companions, the ashab of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the tabi'in and tabi' tabi'in, those that are closest to the Prophet, who were there when the revelation came. Some of them listened to the Prophet for 20 years, okay, and literally it became a second nature for them to see how the Quran is viewed, how it's interpreted. I personally feel a lot closer when I get a bit frustrated with some of the classical, traditions, approach and statements. Then I see some companion, may God bless all of them, Abdullah ibn Abbas, Abdullah ibn Umar, and then there's students like Mujahid and Ikrimah and Qatada, and many others like that. When you hear them speak, it's like a breath of fresh air. The biggest difference is, to me, this is my interpretation, my reading, but I see it very consistently. They truly take the Quran, they put it on a much higher pedestal. And the later generations seem to slightly lower, the expectations from the Quran. And I'm specifically talking about the principle that we are talking about. You see a lot more equivocation about, oh, it said most beautiful, but maybe, it means about the wisdom. The best example is, for example, the couple of verses in the Quran in which it says that everything is in the Quran. It's explained in the Quran. And you read Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, and he says, this is literally every knowledge, everything is in the Quran. And then you start moving to the 9th century, 10th century, and gradually they're like, no, not everything. It cannot be everything. It's everything about, like, Islam, about, faith, about things that matter. The other things don't matter. But the Quran never actually says anything like that. So I will take this seriously, and inshallah, hopefully you'll agree. I found this to be also a very fruitful principle, full of barakah. The Quran, I expect it to outclass the best of human narratives in every way. And that is more challenging to accept when we start reading the Quran, to be honest. Because when you read the Quran, very often we feel like there are all these discrete jumps. In the middle of one story, there's like a verse that seems to come out of nowhere. And it throws us off. We are like, wait, what happened? Like, when did we get to this? Why are we talking about this now? One of the greatest scholars of Quran, and in my personal opinion, in the Muslim history, throughout the Muslim history, was Said Nursi, who is a Turkish Kurdish scholar, a giant, an absolute giant in truly understanding the Quran. In his younger ages, he wrote a short book called Muhakamat, and it is about tafsir. And it has a beautiful introduction, very long introduction, like he has 12 steps, every step has more steps. But one of his key principles that took me a while to understand, and then I realized that it is actually saying something very similar to this. He says that the best way to interpret the Quran is anytime you are in doubt, let its balaghat be your guide. Its eloquence be your guide. And initially, for a while, I thought that he is just meaning that the beauty of the words and so on. Then I realized that's not actually what he means. I mean, think about like any great speaker that, I won't mention names, but everybody knows some that really can move people, that you are mesmerized by their speech. Does their speech jump around? Does it come across as like, like somebody, turning the frequency on the radio and then it jumps from different topics constantly? No. What he really meant is everything must fit perfectly, even when it doesn't appear so. That's why I said this is a principle that's at the beginning a bit difficult to embrace, because you read the Quran and you're like, I don't see it. But maybe the Quran demands a bit more effort. I think over time we see that there is no case in which some verse, some change of direction suddenly seems to come that has a perfect reason. It follows directly from the previous one. But maybe because we misinterpreted what the previous one said, or we are misinterpreting what the new one says. So now I'm going to switch to the third and last principle, and this will again sound like a truism. The Quran is an eternal miracle. But I am going to say, today I spent quite a bit of time since this morning, to be frank, struggling with this slide. And in particular, not to be drawn into like a rabbit hole, because we all have our, things that triggers us, and for me it is this one. And the reason because it's a very sensitive topic for me, I don't exactly know how to explain. The reason it's sensitive is that as Muslims, we should mean what we say, or we should not say it, right? And the Quran also, in the Quran, Allah Jalla Jalaluhu, right, says, يا أيها الذين آمنوا لم تقولون ما لا تفعلون كبر مقتا عند الله أن تقولوا ما لا تفعلون. Oh believers, why are you saying things that you are actually not doing? And then it says this is a big thing in the eyes of Allah. So when it says, we all say the Quran is a miracle. I don't know any Muslim who doesn't say it. But once we actually make it more concrete, more specific, then we realize, do we really believe what we are saying? So let me give you an example, okay? There's a Sahih Hadith, both in Bukhari and Muslim and in other authentic collections, in which the Messenger of Allah says, I am paraphrasing, but this is exactly the content of it. He said that it is his greatest miracle given to him. Before that, he actually says, there has never been a prophet in history who was not given a miracle or miracles to help people believe him. Okay? And then he says, this Quran is my miracle. This revelation is my miracle. And it will endure until the end of the days. And he says, I hope through this miracle, my followers on the judgment day will outnumber any other prophet's followers. So this is why we say the Quran is an eternal miracle. But, we all believe this, yes, we'll all, say yes. But let's be a bit more specific. Let's really talk about what's a miracle. Hazrat Isa ibn Maryam alayhi salam, he spoke in his crib and so eloquently and defended his mother's honor. He healed the blind. He raised the dead after they were dead for several days. He created a bird, the Quran uses the word create, that's why I'm using it, out of clay. And then he just blew into it and it flew. These are miracles. Hazrat Musa parted the Red Sea with a little wooden stick. With the same wooden stick, he made water gush from a rock in the middle of a desert. We're not talking about a little water. It is estimated that the Bani Israel, they say there were about 600,000 adults when they crossed the Red Sea, and scholars estimate that it must have been about 2.5 million population. It was not a little water. It actually says in the Quran, there were 12 springs that came out of it because there were 12 different tribes of Bani Israel. He turned his staff into a serpent that actually just guzzled all the fake magic of the magicians of Pharaoh. Hazrat Sulaiman, he had an army of jinns. He understood animal speech, he controlled the wind, and so on and so on. Now, even if you look at some more minor, I hesitate to say minor, but some Bani Israel prophets, for example, some of whom they are not named in the Quran, they showed miracles that would leave anybody speechless. So for example, Prophet Ezekiel, this is actually told in Surah Al-Baqarah, but the name is not mentioned. But the Mufassirun, they say there are reports that says it was Prophet Ezekiel. And some tribe from Bani Israel, they died. It's a long story, I won't go into all the details. And the estimates is It starts at 3,000, but most scholars say from the wording of the verse actually that it must have been at least 10,000. And the reports go from 10,000 to 70,000 of them who died. And in one version of the report, Allah subhanahu asks Prophet Ezekiel, would you like me to revive them as a miracle for you? And some report says that they were revived after a few weeks, some say after a few years. But in any version, you have at least 10,000 people coming from the dead. Can you imagine the scene, right? And Prophet Elijah, he rained fire from the heavens on their enemies. And so on and so on. So now let's go back to the first statement, the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam's hadith, that the Quran is my miracle. So I want to just pause and slow down and really let Prophet Musa's miracle sink in a little bit. For two reasons. One, I want us to fully really imagine what it is like, and then think about, is that what we feel when we read the Quran? But there is also a second reason. We are going to come back to this scene for our own tafsir. Okay, this scene is very important in our tafsir of the Musa and Khidr story. So this is like one of the verses that this is told in several places in the Quran, but this one has some wording that I really find fascinating. It says, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim in Surah Al-Shu'ara. It says, فَأَوْحَيْنَا إِلَى مُوسَى أَنْ اضْرِبْ بِعَصَاكَ الْبَحْرَ فَانْفَلَقَ فَكَانَ كُلُّ فِرْقٍ كَالطَّوْدِ الْعَظِيمِ. So we inspired Moses, strike the sea with your staff, and the sea parted. And each part was like a huge mountain. There is some debate out there about, how deep was their, path that they went, and some people, because they cannot fully believe it, they were like, well, maybe it wasn't that deep. But this is the Quran. It says it was like huge mountains. So to appreciate the scale, let's just put ourselves in their shoe for a moment to understand what a miracle truly is. And really, are we holding the Quran to the same standard? Now think about this. The mightiest army in the world is chasing after Prophet Musa and 2 million slaves. That's the truth. People who have never fought for 200 years. And there are infants, there are children, there are sick, elderly, all of them. And they are about to be caught up. And in fact, again in the Quran it says, the people cry. They say, Inna lamudrakun. They're going to overtake us. They're right here. We can see them actually. That's what the Quran says. They could see each other. And Prophet Musa, with this, unshakable iman, he says, Kalla inna ma'ya rabbi sayahdeen. What a word to speak. He says, absolutely not. He has zero doubt. They are, by the way, squeezed between the Red Sea and the army behind them. And at that moment, Allah subhanahu says, hit the water. And then 2 million people start walking, inside the water, where the walls are made out of water. And they do not walk for like an hour or 2 hours. In fact, many estimates say that because they're also sick and elderly, and that it took 10 to 12 hours to walk. Can you imagine that scene? Like, what if that water gives in? And the description, and I will just casually drop these words here, which will become very important later in our tafsir. They were walking inside the sea as if going through a tunnel surrounded by 2 big walls made of water. So when they got ashore, again, this is in the Quran. The Quran says, Pharaoh and his army were drowned and you were watching them. So it happened literally in front of their eyes. They saw their oppressors, their tormentors for generations, and his entire army that they feared all their life disappear. So now, if you really, I think it's important to meditate over these scenes, to really understand the scale of it. And will anybody who sees that scene, for how many years will you have dreams about it? Will you ever forget it? And it's a rhetorical question. Yes, I know. I don't want to get into it, but they cross and they forget. But that's a different story. I'm saying for most people, this is something that will be etched into your brain. So this is my question to you, to me, and to all of us. If we are being honest, let's think about this. Think about your entire life. How many times have you read the Quran? Or listened to someone? There are, I think, tens of thousands of videos on YouTube and elsewhere that claim to show us like miracles from the Quran. And you felt the same impact as watching the Red Sea part as in this story. Most people will have panic attack. They will, they will pass out when they see something like that. Or an infant speaking in a crib. Or like, thousands of that people just casually waking up and going back to their lives. That's why it's very sensitive to me, because we all say it. Everybody says it. But I think we have lowered the bar for what a miracle is way too low. Something that's a beautiful kind of phrasing, like a little subtlety here. Oh, great miracle of the Quran. So what am I saying? Don't I believe that the Quran is a miracle? I absolutely do believe it's a miracle. I believe it's a miracle much bigger than any of these miracles. Why? Because Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was the greatest prophet. So the problem is not with the Quran. Okay, the problem is we kind of stop treating it as a miracle. We lower the expectations so much that is something I find very heartbreaking in the tafsir literature, that they will say, this is the meaning of this. One of my favorite mufassir is Al-Tabari, Imam Al-Tabari. May Allah really reward him richly. And he's one of the few that actually will say very openly, he will report 10 different views, and he says, I don't absolutely see any reason for why all 10 of these could be true. Because it's not a book that tells you one story. A miracle, let's think about what would be a miracle, a book in the shape of a book. It would be something that constantly changes and delivers mercy, delivers wisdom that fits precisely the situation that we are in. That would be one aspect of its miracle. So what do these principles mean for our tafsir? The first one that I will take very seriously, I will say we have the right to expect, and nobody can claim to take that from us, that the ending of a story as epic as the journey of Musa and Khidr would be the most perfect. It will have absolutely zero loopholes in it. Which also means that 2-page text, every single word must have a purpose. In fact, not one purpose, inshallah, we will see. The same word sometimes will speak twice, 3 times, 4 times. And every time it's going to fill an other. If you have a little doubt about this, let me show you that actually it's not. Because this is something that classical mufassirun have emphasized. Any thought that can occur to any human being, okay, until the end of the days, do you really think that it doesn't occur to Allah? Of course it does. So he already knows what will occur to you, okay? And if you are really sincerely approaching it, you realize, like, at some point you just give up. You're like, there's no way kind of I can find a hole in this, because it's not answering me one way, two ways. It's answering me in a dozen ways until I'm completely overpowered and I have nothing to say. So there can be no loose ends or redundant characters in the story. And in particular, something we'll talk about today, major figures cannot simply disappear. And we cannot just make stories like, oh, this was not Yusha's journey. This journey was for Musa, so he went back home. This is actually several classical tafsirs saying it. I would rather prefer that they said, we don't know. We don't really know. Why is it that he's never mentioned again after verse 65? Like, the moment Khidr appears, he disappears. Now, maybe there's a sign in that, somebody would think. Maybe there's something we should be thinking about in that connection. Yusha bin Nun was a major prophet. Like we talked about this briefly last week. He fulfilled the promise of Allah to Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam, that nobody could for 700 years. He's not an extra, he's not like some detail in there. So I will, and inshallah, we will insist on these principles and we will not settle for anything less. Meaning that we may not understand everything immediately, but we are going to mark it and say, this is something that is unresolved. We'll classify that as, we will not just make up a story like, oh, he went back home. Based on what? I mean, literally, there's no report that says that. They just state it very confidently. Only a few. And I don't really like to mention names when I say something that sounds critical. And if a story appears to fail any of these standards, my only interpretation of that is that we don't fully understand the story. Because the true story can never have loose ends, can never have something that's not perfect. And inshallah, the more I present, this is the second part, I feel that the 5-part was maybe a bit too ambitious. I don't know if I will be able to finish in 5 parts, because like I said at the very beginning, my goal, I have a dual goal, is both to really get to the bottom of this story and really uncover all the jewels, all the beautiful meanings from it, but also talk about that relates, and that's why kind of I did not want to get dragged into the miracle angle too much, okay? But we cannot keep citing tafsirs from 1,000 years ago, for God's sake. Allah Jalla Jalaluhu, I think, I worry, I fear that when we go on the judgment day, we will be held for account for that. All those classical mufassirun, or the majority, the vast majority of them, I view them as my most distinguished teachers. I have so much fondness in my heart for them. But they lived 1,000 years ago. We need to understand that. And we say another thing, that do we believe it? We say that Allah has 2 great books. One is the Quran, one is the universe. And they are twins. They speak to each other. The Quran tells you about the universe, and the universe tells you about the Quran. We say this, right? So our understanding of the universe, how much has it progressed in the last 1,000 years? Can you compare? How massively different it is? Why would we think that our understanding of the Quran should also not keep pace with that? That as our understanding of the universe improves and we find wonder after wonder, why aren't we finding wonder after wonder after wonder in the Quran? To be clear, yes, there are some, I call those bite-sized miracles. I call them delights, that you see sometimes a video about a small point. But again, the Quran is compared that to parting of the sea. I think that's a good way to think about it. Okay. So I will begin with questions that were never answered about this tafsir. The first one is, I think it's fundamental because there is a journey, right? Everything happens on this journey, and it is really impossible to understand, I think, most of the things on the journey if we don't really figure out why was there a journey in the first place. So last week we talked about this. Almost all the standard tafsirs that I know of, and that is kind of what I was alluding to a few minutes ago. Like if you read, just to give you a general idea, in the book version of this webinar, I list a corpus of tafsirs, which means basically when I say tafsirs do that, tafsirs don't do that, I am referring to the tafsirs in that corpus. And there is about 30 tafsirs in there, and it covers, as far as I know, all the major tafsirs. But the ones that are closest to my heart and the ones that I read most often will be like the tafsir of Al-Tabari. It will be Muqatil bin Sulaiman, the first tafsir that reached us. It will be Mawardi, Al-Thalabi. It will be Fahruddin Razi, Al-Qurtubi, Ibn Kathir. Also Zamakhshari, but I have some critical views about his approach. Not the Mu'tazila angle, something completely different. So there's about 10 that I read very regularly, but then I check the broader set and I don't remember seeing a different answer than this. And it's seeking divine knowledge, and that comes directly from the Al-Bukhari hadith. So the implicit view is that the hadith already answered the question. If you remember from last week when Prophet Musa kind of misspeaks and he says he was the most knowledgeable person on earth, and Allah admonishes them and tells him that there's somebody else, and then Hazrat Musa says, may I go and meet him? All of these words are crucial for understanding what is coming next. Okay, I am really paraphrasing, but very closely the wording of the Al-Bukhari hadith. And then he asks, where can I find him? And he says, take a fish, and where you lose the fish, you will find him. And I would say the majority of Mufassirun interpret this as a humbling. I mean, nobody wants to use or dares to use the word punishment. We cannot use words like that. But like some, teaching a lesson basically. And some others, especially Fakhruddin Razi and Malli Hamdi Yazir and some others, they don't accept that. They say that, this was a conversation, he learned about this person and he wanted to meet him. So I will ask a few questions now, okay? Let's go back to the Quran. One thing that is, to me, miraculous about the Quran, and this is a very simple point actually. To me, I think this is a very obvious point. When you look at all the reports that comes from the hadith tradition, right, that are cited in the tafsirs, there's enormously valuable information, but there are also a lot of information that we cannot sort out. The Mufassirun, they cannot say for sure that it is sahih. They cannot basically. There are 3 different reports from Ibn Abbas that all contradict each other on the same exact thing, and we don't know which one is actually sahih. So didn't Allah know that we will be in this situation? Of course He did. So if He's Arhamur Rahimin, what would you do? Well, you will make sure that the Quran itself always is able to answer these questions if you look hard enough. So anytime there's some confusion, or even when there's no confusion, the best place is to go back and reread the verses slowly and again and again. This is how the story begins. The very first words of the story is Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, وَإِذْ قَالَ مُوسَى لِفَتَاهُ لا أبرح حتى أبلغ مجمع البحرين أو أمضي حقبا. It's the declaration. He basically says, I will never give up until I reach the junction of the two seas, even if I travel for ages. Now, let's look at this word, the last word that I highlighted, huquba. It's translated for ages, but it is not a common Arabic word. The way we know this is when you look at the classical tafsirs, it is probably one of the most commented on words in this entire story. And tafsirs will cite report after report from the Salaf Salihin, the early the companions and the successors, as well as philologists and lexicographers about the meaning of the word. That tells you that it's not a common everyday word. They are themselves not sure. And I will not go over all the list, but if you are curious, you can look at Ibn al-Jawzi's beautiful tafsir, Az-Zad al-Masir, which is not very long, but it is very systematic. He cites 8 different opinions on this single word. And in general, the meanings are like this. Somebody says, I think it's Abdullah ibn Mas'ud says it's 70 years. Okay, somebody else says it's 80 years. Ibn Abbas, I think Abdullah ibn Abbas radiallahu anh says it's a century. Somebody says a lifetime, an eon, an age. These are tremendously long times. So what is Prophet Musa really saying here? When we first read the first time, we went over it quickly. And every single tafsir I know goes over it very quickly. But he's saying something that is very unusual. So this word huquba, like I said, the Quran always interprets itself. It actually, the root haqaba, occurs 2 times in the Quran, only 2 times. And here the meaning, we can interpret in different ways. We may not be clear. The context is not very clear, but we have a lot of reports, that's true. Again, it's the mercy of the Quran that the other occurrence gives us a crystal clear context. So that's a verse that many of us know actually. It is in Surah An-Naba. إِنَّ جَهَنَّمَ كَانَتْ مِرْصَادًا لِلطَّاغِينَ مَآبًا لَابِثِينَ فِيهَا أَحْقَابًا. So it says, indeed, hell is lying in ambush. Look at how scary these words are. Hell is lying in ambush as a home for the transgressors, where they will remain for endless ages. I mean, we all know verses like this in the Quran, the same formula, the same kind of, flow appears dozens and dozens of times. And they all end in خالدين فيها or خالدين فيها أبدا. So we are already trained that in this context, these words, they follow, and that word will mean something like forever. So I hope you are already anticipating where I'm going with this. Prophet Musa is not saying he's going on like a short journey. He says that he will not stop until he finds, and if necessary, he will go for like a lifetime. This is not a normal journey. There is nothing normal about this that says, well, I heard that this other person, this other prophet maybe, has some divine knowledge I don't have. Let me go and learn that. Now, so the key question is, if we take this meaning of huquba, and remember what I said, when the Quran uses a rare word like huquba, it wants to draw attention to it. It says, I'm saying something unusual, okay? Pay attention. This is a word that you don't hear often. You have to look up into lots of dictionaries to find the meaning. And read again. And Musa is saying that he will do this. Now, so the big question is, how could a prophet, any prophet, but especially somebody like Prophet Musa, who is leading a nation of millions of people, say that, well, I'm going to leave my people and go for an indefinite time because I heard that, this person has some knowledge. Now, you might say, no, Allah sent him. Then I will say, bring me a second example of any prophet who was taken from their people and sent basically just to learn some divine knowledge. I say just because divine knowledge is infinite. There is no limit to it. There is no end to it. To me, this is a place that every tafsir should stop and not proceed. What does he really mean? What is he saying? What is he talking about? I mean, imagine this, right? Imagine, for example, unfortunately these days, we don't have any good kings or presidents or leaders to quote and give an example. But think about the father of the family, the bread earner, say, and the protector of the clan. He says, I'm just gonna go forever. Wouldn't people say, where are you going? What are you doing, So what do the traditional tafsirs say? Because they study the word. They say, oh, it actually shows that he was very determined. No, that is something I cannot in good conscience accept as an explanation. Arabic, the Quran has many ways to, indicate determination. Hazrat Musa's entire life is a story of determination. If you look up grit in the in a dictionary, comes Hazrat Musa, it's his life. And the wording before this, La abrahu hatta abluwa majma al-bahrain, even this already sounds like a very determined man. The voice is one of somebody who you cannot basically stop. But the Quran could have done more things. It could have actually, we have like a lam and then noon at the end that we can add to make verbs indicate, to amplify them. He could have said, Wallahi, I will not stop. Okay, there are many ways to get that. There are many ways to indicate determination. Huquba is not one of them. And you can cut this sentence here before awmd huquba. Okay, because he already says, La abrahu is a word that we will study very carefully because it is another key word in this verse that will unlock some doors. La abrahu itself means I will not cease. Okay? In other words, nobody can stop me until I get to Majma al-Bahrain. So the word could end right after Majma al-Bahrain. This is already a very strong declaration. So this is a question that I think we really need to talk about. But what I want to emphasize is this, okay? Prophets are shepherds. They don't leave their people. There is no such thing. Prophets don't take sabbaticals to go and learn some new knowledge, exotic knowledge of the ghaib, of alam al-amr and some other things. Unless it is directly and essentially related to their mission. We'll come back to this point in just a second. Now the second is, we know, for example, prophets, just to explain how tied prophets are to their nation. Okay? There are many prophets whose stories are told and retold in the Quran, and their people were destroyed. Hazrat Nuh, Hazrat Lut, Hazrat Hud, Hazrat Shu'aib, Hazrat Salih. And in every single case, when you read the story, the prophet left in the last moment. There's a conversation of Hazrat Nuh with his son in the Quran, where he begs his son to come on the boat. And he says, no, I'm going to climb a tall mountain. And as he's saying that, the water sweeps him away. So they did not leave like before, on good weather, Prophet Lut, and his people, when they were leaving, they were instructed not to look back, because it was literally happening behind them. The angels come the night before to Prophet Lut, telling them that tomorrow morning we are going to destroy. So even in this case, a prophet doesn't leave their people. And there is actually one example that we know. It's Prophet Yunus, who left just a bit early. And we know the rest of the story, that he was thrown into the ocean, swallowed by the fish, and so on. Just because he left a little bit early, without permission. But there is a more, I think, a most important, maybe I saved the most important to the last. There is one reason, if there is one prophet who should never leave his people, that is Prophet Musa alayhi salam. Because he did leave his people before. Let me quickly pause here and say the following. All scholars agree, okay, there is almost unanimous consent among major tafsirs and scholars, that this journey, which I never mentioned this before, I think I forgot, it happens while Bani Israel and Prophet Musa was wandering in the desert. This did not happen in the Egypt days. There is one or two contradictory reports about that every serious scholar rejects them, so I will not go there. But so we know that this happened, in the desert. And the event I'm going to describe is one of the first things that happened after they crossed into the Red Sea. Prophet Musa, Allah Jalla Jalaluhu, made a vad, made like a promise, made a kind of a meeting for Prophet Musa for 40 days. So he went to Mount Sinai for 40 days to meet with Allah and to speak. And guess who was accompanying him? Yusha bin Nun. And we know the story. 40 days. His people made a golden calf. Made, like it's not even there's an existing God that you worship. Look at the effort. You make, a golden calf by burning, by, melting all the gold that they had, and there's a story in Surah Taha about that, and they started worshiping it. And the scholars that I believe understood Prophet Musa's life the best, they will say that that was the greatest sin ever that the Bani Israel has committed. Because it happened right after the Red Sea crossing. You remember the scene I described? And at the bottom I said, will anybody forget this? Then I said this rhetorical question. And when you read actually the Torah, in the Torah this is told much more explicitly. Where Allah says, this is not a normal thing. Didn't you just see everything that I did? And now you are doing this thing. And they almost killed, Prophet Harun. And this is in Surah Araf. So the very same Musa, how is it possible that he casually says, I'm going to live forever? There is something more here. A prophet never misspeaks. Every word, this is also I think it's my theorem for the Quran, okay? That every word spoken by every prophet in the Quran is fully true. Even when, sometimes you think that they are misspeaking, or, that it's always the truth actually. So why is he saying that? And again, if the purpose is just to learn knowledge, well, Prophet Musa spent, some say 8 years, some say 10 years. The Jewish tradition says 40 years in Madian with Prophet Shuaib, and learned from him. Why couldn't there be something like that? Why couldn't Khidr come to him? Prophet Ibrahim taught his sons Ishaq and Yaqub, and he also taught his nephew Lut. Why couldn't it be like that if it was knowledge? Now again, there's always this tendency of quick kind of getaway, saying that no, it was for humbling. Okay, I'm sorry, but you will have to do, you will have to write an entire book to convince me. Okay, to that humbling was really something that would send Prophet Musa, okay, forever. Or for years, when in 40 days, the people turn like that. So it is 8:07. I am basically going to finish this question 1, and then I'm going to stop. So to me, all the facts that I just stated tell us something very, very clearly, and that is there must be a lot more to this journey than learning about some unspecified divine knowledge, because that is where the tradition stops. So here's my hypothesis. I'm fully affirming, the Bukhari hadith. Honestly, I have no reason to doubt authenticity. By the way, when I say that, you might think, of course you wouldn't doubt. But Fahrettin Razi in his tafsir takes issue, especially with this beginning story. Because when a hadith is classified as authentic, that is a statement about the chain of narration that brought the hadith. It does not always, or it does not necessarily indicate that every word, every sentence in that hadith is actually viewed as authentic. And I don't think I will talk about in this series, but there's a famous, for example, very well-known hadith called the Futun hadith, again about Prophet Musa's life, also in Al-Bukhari. But then when you look at the discussion of great hadith scholars like Ibn Kathir and Jalaluddin Suyuti, they will argue that they will say, this part we think that he actually took it from somewhere else. And so when I say I'm affirming, I'm saying I don't see any issue with the journey's main purpose being about knowledge. But the question is, what knowledge? It must be something essential about the mission. So saying that it was divine knowledge really just scratches the surface of it. Okay? So the goal that we will have, inshallah, is to find that answer. What knowledge was it? This is a man that is burning with a question. On the next slide, I have, maybe I will leave that for next week. But if you please read verse 60 a few times and read it in English, that's perfectly fine. The same voice is present in the translation. I will never give up until I reach the junction of the two seas, or I will travel for ages. That is my next slide, where I ask, does this sound to you like a man who is being sent somewhere? If you are sent somewhere, no, this is a man who wants to go, who demands to go. Because think about this, if Allah is already sending you, what does that really mean? I will not stop until I get there. Well, Allah sent you. If Allah sends you, do we ever know that Allah sends you somewhere but actually He tricks you, He doesn't give you right directions or something? No, if you are on a prophetic duty sent by Allah, He will already guide you there. What does it mean that, I will go for, I will not cease until I get there, or I will look for, why does He even consider the possibility that He will not find the place? I hope this is clear. I think this is a very important point. The voice of Prophet Musa itself is telling us that there is more. He wants to go. There is something there that he needs. By that, I mean, maybe he needs directly for his prophetic mission. But it is not somebody sending him. So what is, again, before concluding, what is really interesting is I have not seen any tafsir even raise this question. Their answer, if they ever even discuss, they will say, oh, it shows determination. But like I said, La abrahu already shows determination. There are many other constructs you can use without saying I will travel for ages, without saying I will travel for a lifetime. That really puts it on a different level. It puts like a time on it, which then forces you to think about the contradiction, about like he left for 40 days. Now he's talking about going forever. There is one more possibility of a prophet saying that. I will just drop the hint and then we'll talk inshallah in the coming weeks. He will only say that as another possibility if he knows that his prophetic mission is over, that the baton was already passed to somebody else. And from historical record, both from Muslim tradition and the biblical tradition, we know that the baton was passed to Yusha bin Nun. So I won't go too much more into that, but that is something important to keep in mind. Very fittingly, I'll end with this. The only person I know who raises this question is Khidr himself, alayhi salam. What a beautiful guide. What an amazing guide. A man that is truly mercy himself. Remember the hadith last week? When Khidr first met Musa, alayhi salam, his first question to him, right, was to express his surprise. He said, what brought you to this land? In another version, it says, what made you come this far? And then he says, surely you must be busy with Bani Israel with leading your people. What are you doing here, basically, he says. He's the only one, actually, who asks this question. How can a prophet go on this journey? And inshallah, next week, we'll continue. But these are threads, and this is how, at least the way I understand the Quran, this is how I see the structure of the Quran. Allah leaves some breadcrumbs, some like threads lying somewhere. And when you notice them, if you take them seriously, if you say, I am not satisfied until I understand this, then you pull on it like the rope. The more you pull, the more comes. And then you discover that there's an entire structure there. That begins with that first question, the second question. So I will stop here and thank you again, all of you, for joining today. And inshallah, we will continue next week. At the end of the lecture last week, there was a suggestion about maybe doing each webinar a bit longer. And my preference is to keep it to around an hour to, not to be too tiring. But at the same time, I'm realizing that I may not be able to finish in 5 weeks. So just to give you a heads up, and I will inshallah, record with those who are present, and then we'll take it from there. But I don't want to do, honestly, injustice to the story by rushing it. Yes. Thank you very much, and hope to see you inshallah next week. Assalamu alaikum.